The morning was unnaturally quiet. The soft chirping of birds barely reached the hospital window, and the scent of fresh lilies' James' daily gesture lingered untouched on the side table. James had barely slept in days. He had counted every breath she took, afraid that if he looked away for a second, she might slip away again. Her body was fragile, her skin pale, and though the fever had broken, Diep remained motionless, caught in a silence that terrified him. But that morning, everything changed. It began with the softest rustle of bedsheets. Then, a breath longer, fuller, James, half asleep in the chair beside her, sat up straight. His heart stopped when he saw her eyes open, blinking slowly against the pale light of dawn. "Diep," he whispered, barely daring to believe it. She turned her head toward the voice, her brow furrowed in confusion, her lips parted, as if searching for a word she had long forgotten. "Who are you?" The question shattered something inside him. James froze. "It's me, James. I've been here, all this time." He reached for her hand gently. "You're safe now, you're awake." But she only stared back, her eyes wide and lost. "I don't remember you," she said, her voice hollow. Silence engulfed the room like a cold fog. James tried to smile, even as his chest tightened. "That's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to remember everything right away." But the truth was sharp and unforgiving. Diep had woken from her coma, but left a part of herself behind. The doctors later confirmed it: partial memory loss due to prolonged trauma and high fever. The past few years, possibly more, were missing from her mind. It was as if the pieces of her life had been scattered in a storm, and James was standing in the ruins. "She may regain her memory," the doctor explained, "or she may never. It depends on time, on her environment, on emotional triggers." James nodded, but his heart was breaking. How do you remind someone of love when they don't even recognize your face? He didn't leave her side. Not that day. Not the next. He spoke to her gently, never forcing her to remember. He showed her the photo album they had created together, told her stories about the time she fell asleep on a boat ride, about how she once tried to cook noodles and nearly burned the entire kitchen down. She would listen, smile politely, sometimes laugh, but there was always distance in her eyes, a wall he couldn't climb. One evening, she looked at him and asked, "Why are you doing all this for me?" James looked down, trying to steady his voice. "Because I love you, and because once, not so long ago, you loved me too." She was silent, and then, with a quiet honesty, she replied, "I'm sorry. I want to remember, but I don't know how." That night, when James walked out to the garden behind the hospital, he broke down. Under the fading sky, he let the tears fall. Not because she had forgotten, but because he remembered every single thing. But love, true love, doesn't give up. The next morning, James came in not as a grieving lover, but as a stranger with hope. He reintroduced himself, with a smile and a fresh bouquet. "Hi," he said. "I'm James. I heard you like daisies." She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing in thought. "Do I? You used to," he said. "Maybe you will again." And so began their story again. He didn't rush her. He simply stayed present, steady, patient. Weeks passed. One afternoon, while they were walking in the garden, she stopped suddenly. "I had a dream last night," she said. "There was a man. He held my hand just like this. He looked at me like the world disappeared when I smiled." James looked at her gently. "What did you feel in the dream?" She stared ahead, lost in thought. Then she whispered, "Safe." And for the first time since she woke up, she held his hand, not out of politeness, but with purpose. She still didn't remember everything, but in that moment, James knew her memory can fade. But love, real love, finds its way back, always. That moment in the garden stayed with James like a fragile miracle. Her fingers had curled into his, not with full recognition, but with trust, and for James, that trust was enough to keep going. In the days that followed, he stopped trying to force memories and instead began creating new ones. He brought her sketchbooks, knowing how much she used to love drawing. She didn't remember the way she used to sit under the tree near the old village house and sketch for hours, but her fingers still moved with grace, tracing lines that seemed almost familiar. Sometimes she would pause and stare at her own artwork, a flicker of recognition dancing in her eyes, then vanishing, like a shadow at dusk. James stayed close, but never too close. He would sit by the window and read aloud, sometimes stories she once loved, sometimes his own words, letters he had written to her during the coma, never knowing if she would wake to hear them. One day, as he read a poem he had written, Diep looked up, eyes clouded with emotion. "That I love you?" she asked suddenly. James was caught off guard, the book slipping slightly in his hands. He nodded slowly, his voice soft. "Yes, you love me deeply." She looked away, uncertain. "And did I say it? Did I tell you? All the time," James whispered. "But it wasn't just your words. It was how you looked at me, how you laughed, how you believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Diep blinked quickly, as if trying to hold back something unfamiliar in her chest. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "It must be painful, watching me like this." James reached for her hand again, his voice steady. "It is, but I'm not here for the past. I'm here because you're here, because you're alive, and because I'd rather start from zero with you than spend forever with anyone else." There was a silence between them, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken promises and slow healing. That evening, a nurse brought in an old music player James had asked for. Soft piano music filled the room, a melody Diep once played on an old, dusty keyboard in her village house. She had played it for her chickens, for the breeze, for the stars. She didn't remember that, but her body did. Her fingers tapped the blanket gently, following the rhythm, and then, slowly, a single tear slid down her cheek. "I don't know why, but this music makes my heart ache," she said, voice trembling. James closed his eyes. "Because it's yours. It always was." Bit by bit, pieces of Diep's soul were finding their way back, not always through clear memories, but through feelings, little sparks buried deep in the heart, waiting for the right moment to ignite. One morning, she stood by the mirror, brushing her hair in silence. James had stepped out to get coffee, and when he returned, he found her staring at her reflection. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I had a dream last night. We were in a field of sunflowers. You held my hand, and I wasn't afraid." James stopped in the doorway, heart pounding. "That's real," he said. "It happened. You took me to see your grandfather's farm when the sunflowers were in bloom. You told me that whenever life felt too heavy, I should close my eyes and remember that place." Diep looked down at her hands, trembling. "It felt so real. It was," James said gently, stepping closer. "And there's more, so much more." Diep looked at him then, really looked, as if something inside her was beginning to click into place, not completely, but enough. "I want to remember you," she whispered. He smiled, tears forming in his eyes. "Then let's fall in love all over again." And so they did, slowly, softly, one day at a time, not clinging to what was lost, but cherishing what could be found again. Because sometimes love doesn't wait for memory. Sometimes love rebuilds it. A lesson about love, memory, and what truly remains. There are moments in life when everything we thought was certain vanishes in a breath, a memory, a name, a feeling, and yet, somehow, even in that silence, something deeper remains, something that cannot be erased. Diep's story is not just about losing her memory. It's about discovering what lies beneath it. Because when she forgot the man who loved her the most, James didn't step back in pain, he stepped closer in patience. And from that quiet, painful space, we learn one of life's most powerful truths. Love is not only what we remember, it is what we choose again and again, even when the world forgets. James taught us what it means to love without conditions, not for the reward of being recognized, not for the comfort of being needed, but for the pure act of being there, of showing up, even when your name no longer brings a spark to someone's eyes. How many of us only give love when we're seen, when we're heard, when we're celebrated? But real love, it doesn't count the days, it doesn't keep score, it waits, it holds, it believes in the silent spaces. And to Diep, though broken and lost in the shadows of her forgotten past, reminds us that even when everything is taken from us, our name, our story, our place in someone's heart, the soul still remembers the feeling of being safe, of being held, of being loved. We may forget people, we may forget promises, but kindness leaves fingerprints on the soul. So here's the lesson. When someone you love is lost, whether in memory, in grief, or in fear, don't walk away just because they don't see you. Sometimes, the most powerful kind of love is not loud or poetic. Sometimes it's silent, patient, and steady, waiting for the light to return, knowing that even in the deepest fog, the heart remembers the way home. Because true love does not depend on memory. It depends on presence, persistence, and a quiet hope that one day they will feel it again. And perhaps one day, as the morning sun pours gently through the window and touches the face of the one we love, something will stir inside them. Not a full memory, not a perfect recollection, but a feeling, a warmth, a comfort, a familiar heartbeat that says, "You are safe here." That's what happened with Diep. She couldn't remember James's name. She didn't know their shared past. But in the quiet way he brushed her hair away from her face, in the way he didn't rush her, didn't force her to remember, didn't cry in front of her, but often behind closed doors, she felt something real, something soft and unexplainable. She didn't need to understand the history to trust him, because love, when true, finds its way back not through the mind, but through the soul. So if you are ever in James's shoes, loving someone who has forgotten how much they once loved you, do not despair. You are not invisible. You are building something deeper than memory. You are writing love on a page that even time cannot tear. And if you are like Diep, lost, confused, unsure of who you are or where you belong, know this: the people who truly love you will never demand that you remember. They will simply stay until you feel safe enough to begin again. Because love is not just about remembering the past. Sometimes, the greatest love of all is having the courage to love someone through the unknown and helping them write a new chapter, one breath, one heartbeat, one quiet morning at a time.